Hello friend, welcome to Nighttime Horror. On this channel, we post the most fascinating and scariest stories told by real people. Make sure you like, subscribe, and watch till the end. Let's get started. Story number 1. The Unseen Ward. The hospital was old, its corridors echoing with the whispers of countless stories, none more chilling than what happened to Emily during her stay. Emily, a young nurse with a passion for helping others, found herself admitted after a mysterious car accident. She awoke in a room that felt too quiet, too still, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. Her first night was uneventful, but as the clock struck midnight, the hospital seemed to come alive in the most unsettling way. The lights flickered, and from down the hall, she heard the soft, rhythmic tapping of footsteps. Emily, ever curious, peeked out her door to see a figure in a nurse's uniform, but something was off. The figure moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, and as it turned, Emily saw the face was blank, devoid of features. The next day, she asked about the night staff, but no one seemed to know who she was talking about. Must have been a dream, they'd say, but Emily knew it wasn't. On the second night, the figure returned, this time stopping at her door. It whispered, "Follow me," in a voice that sounded like it was coming from underwater. Against her better judgment, Emily followed, led through corridors she had never seen before, into a ward that was not on any map of the hospital. Here, the air was thick with a cold mist, and the beds were occupied by patients who looked wrong. Their eyes followed her, but their bodies remained still, as if they were statues. One patient, an elderly woman, reached out with a hand that was too long, too thin, and whispered, "You shouldn't be here." Emily, terrified, turned to run, but the corridor behind her was gone, replaced by a wall of darkness. She spent what felt like hours wandering, the ward's layout shifting around her. Each room she entered was more bizarre than the last. One room was filled with medical equipment that looked like it belonged in a steampunk nightmare. Another had walls lined with jars containing eyes that blinked at her. Finally, she stumbled upon a room where the faceless nurse was tending to a patient. This patient, unlike the others, was alive, writhing in pain, but the nurse was not helping. It was injecting something into the patient's IV that made the patient's skin turn a sickly green. Emily, driven by her nursing instincts, tried to intervene, but as she approached, the faceless nurse turned, and where there should have been eyes, there were now two dark voids. "You see too much," it hissed, and the room began to spin. She awoke back in her hospital bed, the morning light streaming in. Her heart raced, and she was drenched in sweat. When she told her story, the doctors exchanged looks of concern, suggesting perhaps she had a concussion or was hallucinating from medication. But Emily knew what she saw was real. Days passed, and she was discharged. But not before she found an old, dusty book in the hospital library. It spoke of an experimental ward from the early 1900s, where unethical experiments were conducted, leading to the ward being sealed off, its existence denied. Emily left the hospital, but she could never shake the feeling of being watched, and sometimes, in the dead of night, she'd hear the tapping of footsteps outside her window, a reminder of the unseen ward that was not supposed to exist. Story number 2. The Forgotten Room. Tommy was only 9 when he was admitted to St. Mary's Hospital with a mysterious illness that left him weak and feverish. His parents, desperate for answers, stayed by his side, but the hospital was old, with creaky floors and a history that whispered through its halls. Tommy's room was on the 3rd floor, a place where the lights seemed dimmer, and the shadows lingered longer. His first night was uneventful, but as the clock struck midnight, something changed. The room grew colder, and Tommy heard a soft, childlike giggle from the corner. When he looked, there was nothing but shadows. The next day, he told his parents, but they dismissed it as the fever talking. However, Tommy knew it was real. That night, the giggle returned, louder, and this time, a small, pale hand appeared from under his bed, beckoning him. Tommy, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, leaned down. Under the bed was a tunnel, lit by a faint, eerie glow. The giggle came from within, and Tommy, against all sense, crawled inside. The tunnel was narrow, the walls damp and cold, leading him to a room that shouldn't exist. This room was different. It was filled with toys from another era, a crib in the corner, and walls covered in childish drawings. But the drawings were unsettling dark, twisted figures and faces with too many eyes. The room felt like it was from a different time, untouched by the outside world. In the center of the room stood a boy, about Tommy's age, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. He had a sad smile, and eyes that seemed too old for his face. "I'm Jack," he said. "I've been waiting for someone to play with me." Tommy, though scared, felt a strange kinship with Jack. They played with the toys, but each game ended with Jack's laughter turning into sobs. "I want to go home," Jack would cry, and the room would grow colder. Tommy asked about Jack's home, and Jack pointed to a drawing on the wall of a house, but it was burning. "That was my home," Jack whispered. Before the fire, Tommy realized Jack was a ghost, trapped in this forgotten room. He promised to help Jack find peace. Jack led him to a hidden diary under the crib, filled with entries from a nurse who had cared for Jack after the fire. The diary revealed Jack had died in the hospital, his body never claimed, his spirit left behind. Tommy, back in his room, shared the diary with his parents, who were skeptical until they showed it to the hospital staff. The diary was from 1923, and records confirmed a fire had occurred, with a child named Jack listed as deceased. The hospital decided to honor Jack. They held a small memorial service in the hospital chapel, where Tommy placed the diary. As the service ended, Tommy felt a warmth envelop him, and the giggle he heard was now joyful, fading away like a whisper in the wind. Tommy recovered quickly after that, his fever gone. The night before he was discharged, he visited the forgotten room one last time. It was empty, the toys gone, the drawings faded. But on the wall where Jack's burning house once was, there was a new drawing, a boy and his new friend, playing happily under a bright sun. Tommy left the hospital with a sense of closure, but he never forgot Jack. Sometimes, in the quiet of night, he'd hear a soft giggle, not of sadness, but of a friend who had finally found peace. Story number 3. The night the lights went out. The Carter family was driving home from a camping trip when their car skidded off a remote road, crashing into a tree. The impact was jarring, but miraculously, everyone was alive, though shaken. The night was pitch black, the kind where your eyes strain to see anything beyond the immediate. They managed to call for help, and soon, the wail of an ambulance broke through the silence. The paramedics were efficient, loading the family into the vehicle, promising safety and medical care. But as they drove, something felt off. The road seemed unfamiliar, the ambulance's interior too dimly lit, and the paramedics' faces obscured by shadows. They arrived at what seemed like a hospital, but it was eerily quiet. The corridors were dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering sporadically. The family was separated, each taken to different rooms for treatment. The youngest, Lily, was the first to notice something was terribly wrong. Her room had no windows, and the medical equipment looked outdated, almost antique. Her parents, in their own rooms, felt a similar unease. The doctors who attended them had cold, clinical voices, and their hands felt like ice. As the night deepened, the hospital silence was occasionally broken by distant, mechanical sounds, not unlike those of old machinery. Lily's father, Daniel, tried to leave his room, but the door was locked from the outside. Panic set in, he shouted, but there was no response. His wife, Sarah, in another room, heard his cries, but couldn't move. She was strapped to her bed, her full drip feeding something that made her vision blur. Back with Lily, a figure entered her room. It wasn't a doctor or nurse, but a man in tattered clothes, his face hidden by shadows. "You shouldn't have survived," he whispered, his voice a mix of sorrow and menace. Lily, terrified, realized these weren't paramedics or doctors. They were criminals, perhaps escaped convicts or worse, using the guise of a hospital to finish what the accident started. The man explained, his voice echoing in the sterile room, that they had been chosen for a reason. This hospital was a front, a place where they could experiment, harvest, or simply dispose of people without a trace. The family's accident was no accident, it was orchestrated. As the night wore on, each family member faced their own horror. Daniel was subjected to what seemed like medical experiments, his screams muffled by the thick walls. Sarah, drugged, saw visions of her family's demise, each more grotesque than the last. Lily, the youngest and perhaps the most resilient, found a moment when her captor was distracted. She managed to unlock her door, only to find the hallway a labyrinth of darkness and whispers. She ran, her bare feet slapping against the cold floor, until she stumbled upon a room filled with old medical records, each detailing similar stories of families who had disappeared after accidents. Among them, she found a map of the hospital's layout, which showed an escape route. Gathering her courage, Lily navigated through the shadows, avoiding the patrols of these false doctors. She reached her parents' rooms, freeing them with keys she found in the records room. Together, they made their way to the supposed exit, but the story's end remains unknown, leaving the fate of the Carter family shrouded in mystery and horror.